such a pleasure to be here with Lyn, who has uncovered this amazing history of a family that's moved through history. And of course, we'll be talking about this movement, for the next 45 minutes or so, and then I'm going to give you a chance to answer questions. Now, Lyn, you were only 5, and of course, you were very blonde, blue-eyed. So was your mother and father and your grandparents. And this photograph you saw of your paternal Scottish grandparents, as you say, very Scottish, very white. And behind, somewhere in that image, was a man, a few shades darker, and you were intrigued. And then your mother told you that he was your grandfather. So he wasn't, of course, and that he was Indian, which came as a shock to you as a 5-year-old. He wasn't, of course, just any Indian. He was the Nawab Nazim of Bengal. And this, Bengal, we all know, we've all seen Clive of India, we all vaguely know what happened, the Battle of Plassey, 1757. So this is the family we are talking about. So Lyn, just for those who don't know, just tell us why this family is so important in the history of not just India, but Britain as well.
Yes, well, it is a history that is very troubled, and my friends in India, when I tell them who my family is, look at me a little askance, because I am descended from Mir Jafar, who was installed by Clive of India after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and who agreed to the East India Company having full trade agreements and indeed full control over Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, the whole of East India. And in return, Mir Jafar was promised a very large pension and various rights and so on, which gradually descended through 8 successive Nawabs to my great-grandfather, who was 8 years old when his father died at the age of 28, and he was installed on the throne of as Nawab of Bengal. So that's very briefly the history. Throughout that time, thanks to Mir Jafar's agreement with the East India Company, the reigning Nawabs were controlled very, very firmly by the British government. First of all, the British government in Calcutta, and there was a British agent based in Murshidabad, which had been the capital city before the British moved to Calcutta, who kept a very, very close eye on the Nawabs there. So yes.
Sorry. No, so, I mean, of course, this is the pivotal point in history, because this is when East India Company came in as traders and actually start ruling. They become rulers. So this is when the transformation takes place. And of course, your great-grandfather's name was Mansur Ali Khan,
yes,
known as the Nawab Nazim of Bengal, which was then Bengal, Bihar, Orissa. I mean, a huge kingdom with lots of wealth, which is being filtered down, and he is being pensioned down. So the first part of the book, you talk about, let me hold up the cover. So this is him, for all of you to see. This is Lyn's great-grandfather, the Nawab Nazim, and he arrives in England. So why does he arrive? What drives him here? Well, tell us. He comes in, I've written it down.
1869,
That's right.
Yes.
So he comes. Victoria is on the throne, 1869.
Yes.
He arrives.
Yes. Well, over the years, because each successive Nawab the Nawabs tended to have very short lives, and therefore were succeeded by very, very young minors. And in each case, the British would decide that the stipend or the pension that had been agreed was not necessary for this young child, but it was never actually increased once they became 21 or whatever the majority was. And by the time my great-grandfather had become Nawab, the pension agreed with Mir Jafar as a hereditary pension had been reduced to about 1/10 of the original amount. And and so when Dalhousie, well, there are two issues. When he was 18, a British agent called Whitlock Torrens, Henry Whitlock Torrens, was in charge, and Torrens persuaded this very young Nawab, still in his teens, to invest his money with a company in Calcutta. Now that was several millions of rupees, and the money very quickly disappeared from that company into Torrens' account. And also a great many of the jewels that had belonged to the palace also disappeared, including the Hanover Cross, which had been given to his father by William IV. And these later turned up in the hands of Torrens' mistress, who was an actress in Calcutta. And there's a story there somebody needs to dig out too. But anyway, so there was that. A whole lot of money just disappeared. The pensions had been decreased. Then Dalhousie, who was then Governor General and who was very eager to get rid of all Indian princes whom he saw as a threat, Dalhousie decided that the Nawab was responsible for the deaths of two servants who had been beaten and who had died on a safari, and had been beaten by one of his servants. And Dalhousie removed the rights to not appear in court, which was given to all royalty, European and Indian at the time, and also reduced his gun salute. He had a 19-gun salute, which was big, a big status symbol, and it was reduced to 13. Okay. And the Nawab was so upset by this that he refused to go to any ceremonial occasions where the gun salute would be played. So there are all these reasons. He wrote lots and lots of memorials to the Governor General, and the Governor General simply dismissed them or refused to read them. So finally he decided he would go and speak to Queen Victoria himself. He was particularly aggrieved, and again, this is not to his credit. He supported the British in the War of Independence, or mutiny, whichever, with elephants and money, and he had assumed that his loyalty to the Queen would be repaid, and it wasn't. Okay. So he decided to go to England and petition Parliament and the Queen for the restoration of his money and his rights. Okay. And so in 1869 he went. He went via Paris, where he was received by the Emperor Napoleon III, and had a great time in Paris. And then he went on to England, where he was introduced to Parliament and presented his petition.
So they were expected to be princely, weren't they, at this time, to wear all their regalia and look princely. And did he do that? Indeed. Did he enjoy doing that?
He did. Interestingly, when he was in India and when he was on safari and when he was at home, he dressed in very simple, simple white clothing. But when he went to India, when he went to Paris, and when he came to England, he was expected to look the jewel in the crown, and that's what he was. Queen Victoria thought he was wonderful and invited him to lots of receptions. He was, the press wrote, and they always wrote about how he was dressed, his jewels, his turban, his silk tunics. So it was this exotic oriental jewel, as a jewel in the crown, that was written up every day almost in the British papers, wherever he went. And he went to lots and lots of aristocratic gatherings, to the races and so on, and everywhere it was reported. So.
And then this aristocratic, princely man falls in love with the maid who was cleaning his hotel room. She was, oops, I've dropped something. The mic's gone. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, fine, that's fine. Her name was Sarah Venel. She was from East London. And, well, he already had 2 wives and children before, from who he'd left behind in India, and then he'd come to London. So, but he does marry Sarah. They do fall in love, and he respects her. He marries her. How was that received? By the aristocrats who wouldn't take it. And what did he do? I mean, I know about it, but I want you to tell them.
Okay. Well, yes. Well, in fact, he had 3. He had three wives still living in India. So Sarah became his 4th wife, and and she was 17. He went to her father, who lived in Lambeth. It was very, very poor, a very poor family with a tiny little shop in Lambeth, same street as Charlie Chaplin's family lived on, and asked permission to marry her. And family records say that that the father was anxious to make sure that this was a legal marriage, and so there was a nikah marriage ceremony in the Alexandra Hotel, which was where she had worked as a chambermaid, and they were married. Now, there is absolutely no mention of Sarah in any of those hundreds of newspaper reports about the Nawab until very, very late, and I assume that in fact most people didn't know about the marriage. That it was kept very quiet, and the Nawab remained living in the Alexandra Hotel for several years, and Sarah lived in another house in Kensington, quite close by.
He bought her a big house, didn't he? He kept her very well.
He bought her a house and
gave her a lot of respect as well.
And that would have been his wives. Similarly, in Murshidabad had their own houses. It was the way in which he would assume. He had in the Alexandra Hotel a retinue of 12 servants, including cooks, scripture writers, musicians, valets, secretaries, and so on. And she too would have had servants in the house. So I'm assuming she remained, as far as I can tell, a Christian, and because she was a woman of the book, and he was a Shia, this was an acceptable marriage according to Islamic rules. Now, they had 6 children. He remained in London mainly because the British, first of all, turned down his petition. There was a vote in Parliament in which 64 voted in his favour and 121 against. The 64 who voted in his favour were all Irish politicians, which is interesting. But they lived mainly in London, in various houses in London. They had 6 children, of whom the youngest was my grandfather. And at the end of the 10 years, he took up with another maid. And Sarah, my grandmother, was distraught. And he then, having been forced more or less to abdicate, because otherwise his money would simply be cut off completely, was returned to India with the children.
So he was forced to abdicate because he married, or was that an excuse? A good excuse?
It was made an ingredient. The excuse, the British simply wanted the money, the estate, the power. Sure. They didn't want a powerful prince in India, and they didn't want him to go back to India actually, because they thought he would make trouble. But one of the reasons they gave was that he had taken up with a woman of low extraction, and that he had proved himself to be not to be worthy of the way in which a Mohammedan royalty should live. So, and moreover, he lived in a suburb of London, which would seem to be one of the most outrageous things with this woman of low extraction.
Yeah. He couldn't take Sarah to any of the receptions at the palace.
No.
Yeah, she had to be kept away. So he had to just
And I think this had to do, again, I'm very interested in, I mean, first of all, it had to do with the fact that he would not have thought of taking his wife to a reception, no matter who she was. But secondly, I think it would probably had to do with an awareness that it seemed to me in Britain at this time, class was a much more significant issue than even race or religion. So Sarah was completely an outcast as far as the upper class British were concerned.
In fact, it's really interesting you write about, because at this time, London was crawling with lots of exiled princes, you know, all decommissioned, all their lands taken, and they often came here. So, you know, we know Maharaja Dilip Singh, he was one of them. He'd come here as, you know, when he was just a teenager. And you mentioned how all these exiled princes, they keep meeting and they're all asking for their pension. So, you know, Lyn, tell them about the Exiled Princes Club, which I found a fascinating topic.
Yes, well, I was intrigued to find that I mean, as Ramachandra Guha was mentioning in his talk earlier this morning, there was a great deal. There were many British who opposed what was happening in Empire, and there was a great deal of sympathy for the Nawab and his case. But there were also a number of other princes who had been deprived of their of their estates and their money for various excuses. Dalhousie introduced this policy of not allowing adoptive princes, so that if there was no direct inheritance by birth, lineage, and some, you know, we're not allowed to adopt, and British would simply, you know, say, okay, it's ours now. So there were a number of deprived Indian royalty in London petitioning their cases, and there were lots and lots of articles in journals, newspapers, and books being published, you know, seeking to defend them and asserting their rights, which I found very interesting. So, I mean, it was because I was looking at this sort of these newspapers, and I realised there was a whole community of Indian princes in London. Most of them didn't stay for 10 years. Most of them came for a year, six months or so. All their representatives were there. But anyway, Dilip Singh, of course, as many of you know, had been brought as a child to Britain, and the Punjab had been taken over by the British, and he and the Nawab and various other people formed an Oriental club, which was designed to try and exchange and educate others about India and Indian culture. I'm not sure how long it lasted, but it was announced in the papers.
Well, they must have had some really good food there,
yes,
served up by all their khidmatgars, etc. So he returns. Nawab Nazim returns to India, and then the second part of your book goes on to his son. So your grandfather,
yes.
And he is called Nawab Nusrat Ali Mirza.
Yeah.
So how was it for him? Because, you know, he is growing up with a very limited pension by now. Forget Nawab of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa, he is now the Nawab of Murshidabad, you know, this little North Bengal town. And so it's shrinking, yet he is a prince, and he goes to Oxford, doesn't he?
Yes.
And he wears his princely clothes. So tell us about him. The conflict he faced. I mean, the racism sometimes, as well as the, you know, everything else.
Well, when the Nawab took the children back to India, there were at this point 4 surviving children, 2 girls and 2 boys. The 2 girls remained all their lives in India, and as far as I can tell, happily so. One of them, my great aunt, used to write to us when I was a teenager. So, but the 2 boys were brought back to England because when the Nawab died, which is 1884, 4 years after he had returned with the children, he wrote, he asked that the boys should be sent back to England for an education, that they should receive a good Mohammedan education in England, and the girls were to stay in India. So the boys were sent back in the care of one of the Nawab's secretaries, and they were sent to, in fact, the King's College School in London, where they did very well, especially at sport. They were very good cricketers, rugby players, and they also did quite well academically. And then they went on to Oxford, where they didn't do very well at all. But my great uncle clearly enjoyed Oxford a lot and liked being a prince and liked the whole sort of patronage. And he joined, the Oxford Dramatic Society. There's pictures of him in The Taming of the Shrew, and he was dressing up, and he belonged to the cricket club and the rugby club and the Phoenix Club and almost every club possible. And my grandfather, the younger brother, the youngest of the children, there are reports of neither of them. They both had trouble passing their scripture exam, which they had to pass at the end of the first year to proceed to the second. And I haven't been able to sort of dig into exactly what that would have involved, but again, it's very interesting. But finally, they did pass their scripture exams, and they were able to proceed to a second and third year, but neither of them actually graduated in the end. And my as I say, my uncle Said was remained in London all his life, became a special constable in World War II, and whereas my grandfather disliked being a prince, disliked it immensely, and decided that he wanted to emigrate. Essentially, he didn't want his children. I mean, it's a little bit like Harry and Meghan, deciding that he wanted to escape the title, to move and let his children have a normal life in another country, another world.
So he married another English woman, right?
Yes, yes.
So now the family was becoming more English as they married into the English family. So when does he move? How old was he when he moved to Australia?
Well, he was 48.
48, okay.
And it was crazy. It was a crazy idea. He decided he was going to be a farmer, and I think he had no idea that farming in Australia was somewhat different from farming in Wales, where they had been living, especially in Wales, and he went to an agricultural college with his son, who was only 15, and I think learned very little, and the farm was a bit of a disaster. But I think the interesting thing was that in order to move to Australia, and he had to change his name, because at the time there was a policy called the White Australia policy. And the White Australia policy meant that, which had been brought in 1901 when Australia became a federal government and independent, more or less, was intended to preserve, as one politician, the purity of the White Australia race, which was almost singularly existing in Australia, is obviously ignoring the people who had originally been existing in Australia before the colonisers came. And interestingly, again, the talk earlier this morning struck me very much, because the White Australia policy was partly inspired by what was happening in South Africa. The fact that in Natal there had been division between people of Asian descent and the British, and Australia decided to bring in a very similar policy, And it was directed specifically against Chinese and Indian people rather than African people. And the argument was that because Indian people and Chinese people already had civilizations, they would be more at odds with the European civilization. But also inspired by Natal, they had brought in a language test, which was so rather than saying it's because of your color or your race as it was envisioned, you had to take a language test, and that language test could be in any language that the officials decided they would use. It could have been, Dutch. It could have been, depending on who it was, they were very like what happened with the registration tax in the American South, when African Americans were trying to register for the vote. Those similar tests to that. So anyway, he changed his name.
What was his name? What
He
English
changed his
name?
name to Norman Allen Mostyn, which seems to me a very naff name. And he insisted that he had to be known by that name because the Australian government said you can enter. You may be a half caste. Their words. They said he is a half caste, but nevertheless he looks
English.
He looks okay. He looks okay. He can probably pass. And so as long as he never tells anybody that he's really, really Asian, he can come to Australia.
And was this sheep farming out in the outbacks? Where did he go?
Yes, friends in Australia have been rather joking about the title Australian Outback, because Outback is very much a British version of Australia.
Okay.
It was about 150 miles from Sydney.
All right.
And it was very remote. It was over the mountains, very remote, and the nearest neighbours were miles away. So it was.
So
it was
at this
sort of outback.
So at this time, did he have in a little box, all some of his princely regalia and other things, or had he just packed that away and gone?
He had. When I was a small child, my grandmother showed me his tunic and his dress sword, and his Quran was always kept there. I mean, he died when I was only 1 year old, so I never knew him. But his my grandmother, his wife, kept his Quran always very visible in the house, and she had his seal, the family seal, which was Nil Desperandum. It was an appropriate seal, but she showed us his dress uniform at one stage. So she kept that, my grandmother delighted in being a princess, and that was. It ended up being really a cause of great friction between them, because he wanted to be a commoner, he wanted to be an ordinary person, she wanted to be a princess.
Right. So now this brings me to your role in this whole thing. You started uncovering this story, and as a teenager, you received letters from your great aunt, which started you off.
Yes.
So this is sister of the Nawab.
Yes.
And tell us about it. What got you interested, and then how you researched this story. From where did you find all the material? Was it letters, archives?
Well, yes. I mean, as I was growing up, it was still at the time of the White Australia policy. We did not. My mother more or less refused to talk about our Indian ancestry. We knew it was there, but it wasn't something we talked about. It wasn't something we were supposed to tell other people, although other people did know about it. And when I first started going to school, which was not till I was 10, school children would say, "Well, how's the little black princess?" And which surprised me. It took me a while to realize what they meant by that. But in Australia, anybody who is not white is black. That's and then so for quite a long time it was something that was just kept in the background, not discussed, not talked about. And then around in the mid-50s, my great aunt Vahidunisa began to write to us, and she was a remarkable woman, but she wrote. It was at the time that my mother's cousin, Iskandar Mirza, had become, first of all, president of Pakistan, and then in '58 there was a coup by Ayub Khan. So her letters were all about that, and also responding to the Suez crisis in terms which were very different from the ones that were being sort of broadcast or written about in the Australian newspapers. So this was a kind of opening up into another perspective. And she also sent little presents. She sent me this little scarf from Murshidabad. She sent me a little bottle of perfume, which I still have. and this correspond. And the other interesting thing about this was that she although she must have spoken English as a child, she now spoke only Urdu, and so her letters were dictated in Urdu, transcribed, and sometimes the scribe would write little extra notes in the letters, which were not always in agreement with what Vahidunisa herself was saying about the politics of the time. I mean, he had no time for Iskandar Mirza, for instance, and was outraged by the British behaviour in the Suez Canal, whereas she was slightly more diplomatic about it. So again, the sense of a kind of a more complex world out there was something, and so yes, I went to university. I began to want to know much more about this world, and then I went to the States, where India is at that time in the 60s was pretty much unknown. It's changed now a great deal, but it was a very different world then. It was only when I came to England to teach at the University of Kent that I began to be able to get access to. There are volumes and volumes of papers in their office in the British Library, which contain all these reports on the Nawab, his school reports, his childhood reports, the agents' reports, the letters from the agents to and from him, rebuking him for his behaviour and so on. So this was what gave me the source for writing the book. And I went to Murshidabad and various other places in pursuit of him, and it was great.
So, in fact, on the subject of Murshidabad and silk, the banners flying outside, the big silk banners, some of them say Murshidabad, they're made of Murshidabad silk. So I know, and they write it in Bengali over there, so that's a little connection there for you. So the first time you went to the palace, Murshidabad Palace, which I visited as a child, and I remember nothing of it. It just looked really big, and big chandeliers, that's all I remember. What was that like, seeing your ancestors' photographs in this sort of faded manner, I suppose, by then, fading palace?
No.
How was it kept at the time?
No. Well, it was very moving, actually. Because I mean, both extraordinary. And because when I went with a friend who was from Tamil Nadu and Hindi speaking, and she was very eager that we should go together, and that I should meet my family, but there is a gallery which has all the ancestors going right back beyond Siraj Udwala, who was and including two four portraits, very full life-size portraits of my great-grandfather, and he was a very handsome young man, very elegant, and of course, no doubt the portraits idealized him a little, but he's nevertheless. So one portrait in which he's wearing red and looking very regal and standing, with a scroll, and another in which he's wearing white silk and lounging back and looking absolutely amazingly glamorous. And then some of them older ones, like the one on the cover. But there are also his father and his grandfather and so on. No portraits, almost no portraits of any of the women. Sometimes of children, but none of the women, which is a little sad, because I would like to have seen what my great-grandmother looked like.
So you never met Wahidun Nisa, who wrote to you, your great-aunt?
No, she died...
and there were no photographs of her?
And there were no photographs of her. She died in 1968, while I was in America,
Okay, right. And you met the family, presumably, because
Yes.
I think they still... Has it become a hotel now, some of it?
No,
the palace is
no,
some
the
of
palace is now a federal museum.
It's a museum.
And it's very well
okay.
preserved. And hundreds of people visit it. Mostly lots and lots of school children. But it's very well preserved. It looks like the National Gallery. And it's in that style. It's very European, and it was built as a kind of statement, back by my great-grandfather. And it is well preserved, and it's full of artifacts, and still has all the chandeliers, which I think were apparently a present from Queen Victoria.
Were they? Oh. No wonder they impressed me as a child.
Yes.
Right. And were the family there? I mean, what was your interaction like with some,
yes,
some of the descendants?
I met several cousins, and including the one who was the direct descendant of the Nawab, who was extremely warm and welcoming, and invited me to his house and showed me photographs of his father, and it was great. And I've been back twice, and each time met more cousins. But yes,
I should go sometime. And I'm going to open it up, because I'm sure there's lots of questions from those who know Bengal and those who, want to know, and those who want to visit. It's all been really done up now, tourism-wise. So they have lots of beautiful heritage buildings to stay in, I believe. So yeah, let's go.
Yes, you mentioned that your...
Hold it closer.
Your grandfather and his brother and the sisters were sent back to India.
Yes.
I'm interested to find out what happened to their mother.
Yes.
Sarah Venel. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, of course, was devastated when she found out about the relationship with the second maid. She was devastated and went to her father's house, and while she was there, the decision was made to take. She wasn't told to take the children, and there was nothing. And when she did protest, she was told that if she didn't let them go, there would be no provision for the children. So she felt there was nothing she could do. Now, when they after the Nawab died in 1884, and the boys were brought back, she learned that they had come back, and she tried to get custody. And there were she appealed. Her brother had been the Nawab had sort of taken in her younger brother and paid for him to be trained as a lawyer. And he acted on her behalf and went to court to try and get custody. And the first attempt in 1885 went against her, because they said, A, she was a woman of low extraction. Secondly, she had allowed the children to go to India. Thirdly, it was the father's right. And so then, in order, at the time, the law was, if you were legitimately married, the father had the right to the children. But if they were illegitimate, the mother had the right.
Yeah.
So she then claimed that marriage was not legitimate, which was a huge decision because it meant loss of respect, which was important to her, very, very important. It meant she could no claim to any kind of pension or rights. But it might mean she could get the children. But in fact, the court ruled that the marriage was legal, and therefore, she could not have the children. And 2 years later, the guardian died. One of the Nawab's sons, his oldest son, who was then now the Nawab of Murshidabad, supported her and wrote and said it had been, and said he did not wish, to retain any custody over the children, and that she should have it. And so it was only in 7 years after they'd been taken away that she regained custody of the 2 boys, but never of the 2 girls.
In a way, it's so similar to what happened to James Kirkpatrick's children.
Yes.
They were taken away from the mom and sent to England.
Yeah.
In fact, also Dilip Singh, he was snatched from his mother and
Yes.
sent away. And Nawab Nazim, your great-grandfather, he was also separated
That's
from his
right.
mother
Yes.
because both the women were quite radical and feisty, and they thought they would influence them. So they were both torn as young children from their mothers. So
Yes, the British agents were constantly rebuking for the Nawab when he was in his teens for going to see his mother, and they removed him, from the mother's quarters to because they thought she was a bad influence. But she was quite a strong woman, and so yeah.
there's a question there.
Hi, thank you, Shrabani and Lyn, for this fascinating talk. I'm Danish. I'm a journalist, author, and also someone who's researching Muslim capitalism at Oxford. But the connection is that Iskandar Mirza's mother came from a Bombay family. And I wanted to just know from you is this tag of being from the Mir Jafar family, how much did it affect the fortunes of the family because of the way he was perceived? Or did you see a cutoff point or a certain period where people didn't bother them that much about associating them with that? And I presume there was some family in Bangalore as well related to the Murshidabad, because this foreign secretary of Pakistan also wrote a book on Parsee, which perhaps showed that he had some links with the Murshidabad family. So anything in your record that came out about the external family links? Thank you.
Yes, I think it seems to me that within the family histories, there's Humayun Mirza, who is Iskandar Mirza's son, has written a book about the family, and he essentially, he argues that Mir Jafar acted sensibly because Siraj-ud-Dawla was a terrible ruler and irresponsible and so on. But on the whole, it seems to me that whole history is rather pushed into the background and glossed over by descendants. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question completely here. But
Whether there were other family links, did you notice them marrying? Because you spoke about how difficult it was, for him to marry in a sense that he was already married. So what was the family response? And it seems that there was a tradition of them marrying outside, and they said that Iskandar Mirza's mother came from Bombay.
yeah, for instance, when I met Humayun Mirza in the 1980s, he had not known about the English family, quote unquote, and he was extremely suspicious that I might be trying to make claims on what he felt were his rights of descent. So it seems to me that in a way it's a story that was not particularly well known in the family as a whole, and subsequently, after publishing this book, various cousins in Pakistan and India have written to say that they feel that the book is somewhat indiscreet and possibly may damage the marriage prospects of future generations.
Good Lord. Oh my goodness. Honestly. Honestly. I'm sure they'll be fine. So you were also brought up in Australia,
Yes, I
right?
was,
And
yes.
then you moved. When did you move to England?
Well, I moved to America in
In
1963 and sort of became a child of the 60s. But and then I came to England in 1975.
Right. Okay. Right. Any? Yeah.
Yeah, hi Lyn. That was a fascinating story. I mean,
Thank you.
I mean, in the sense, I mean, people do genealogy and you have programs like Who Do You Think You Are? I mean, yours is a fascinating story for that actually, isn't it? I mean, and it's a story that's waiting to be told. I mean, your own personal story. That's the point I'm interested in. I mean, for example, in Shrabani's lovely book on Victoria and
I have
Abdul.
no royal ancestors.
Sorry? No, but
I
in
just
your
listen.
Victoria and Abdul book, you know, your whole process of researching that you did for the book, you know, that was an adventure by itself. I mean, in fact, that was a fascinating story by itself, right? I mean, how you did that. That's the bit I'm curious about. I'm saying, so I'm assuming this book was published quite recently?
Yes,
Last
yes.
year?
It was
So-
published last August.
Last August,
and
okay.
the paperback has just come out this now.
Excellent.
So-
So the question was really, I mean, given that this is a story that's waiting to be told in your family, it's such a personal one. What about your own? I mean, in the sense that it took some time for you to kind of, you know, were you just waiting for the right appropriate moment or phase of life, or were you just collecting together? Why now and why not? Let's say, you know, 30 years ago, really. I mean, just out of curiosity.
Well, it's a good question. One is, as I say, I was that it was a long time before I felt I had the right to write about it, for various reasons. And I have to say, my brothers and sisters back in Australia are still not altogether happy about the fact that I'm doing so. There's still, Australia remains quite a racist place. It also took me a long time to feel that the major reason is that I was an academic. I was writing academic books and churning them out for to meet the requirements of my university and my bosses. And it was only after I retired that I actually had the time to sit down and feel that this is actually the book I want to write. And it has been, I have to say, way back, you know, I thought of writing it as a novel. And then I realized I just didn't know enough to do it. So it's always been a story I wanted to write, but I had really to wait till I was retired. And then I needed to travel to spend a lot of time in archives and a lot of time thinking about it and learning Urdu and all kinds of things to try and get a sense of this world that my ancestors had belonged to.
5 minutes more. Any pressing questions? How many of you have travelled, been to Bengal? Anybody? Hands up? Yeah? Oh, lots. Margaret, of course, works there. She teaches in Bengal. So lovely to see you, yeah. Have you been to Murshidabad? You have? Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry, Margaret. Mike is coming your way.
Yes, we sailed up from Kolkata to Murshidabad and got stuck on a sandbank, which was not very pleasant. But arriving in Murshidabad, it's an amazing centre, and the palace is just wonderful. And I can imagine, as a young person looking at it, you must have been in awe of what there was there. And your story is truly fascinating, and it crosses so many barriers of culture and history and what the British were up to, really, which was not very good at the time. And so thank you for that. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret. So what, sorry. Oh, is that a question this side? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm just intrigued by this, this brilliant Nawab from Bengal comes and marries your grandmother, the chambermaid. And then not only that, he then marries another chambermaid. I don't know, do you cover the second chambermaid in your book at all? What happened to her? It's really intriguing.
Well, no, interestingly, I mean, she is somebody who I'm interested in, and I had met one or two of her descendants quite early on when I was beginning to think about writing the book. She, unlike my great grandmother Sarah, she converted and changed her name, so she became known as Muhammadi Begum, and she went to India with the Nawab, and there she had 3 sons, and she came back, but unfortunately she, I think she didn't have anybody to support her in the way that Sarah. I mean, Sarah's brother fought very, very hard on her behalf. So although Sarah did lose out quite a lot, she didn't lose out as badly as Julia, who was the other maid. Julia later remarried, and that, in terms of the will, meant that she wouldn't get anything. But I have seen letters from the sons who all 3 of whom did rather falter. One fought in World War I and was clearly suffered from bad post-traumatic illnesses, and another, simply a series of failed businesses. So there's a little bit about her, and her story is one I'd like to pursue, but I couldn't find, and I couldn't get in touch with people to try and get those papers for her. Yeah.
Amazing. So when you were researching this story, sorry, I talk too much. Is there anybody else who wants a question? No? Okay, so I should babble on. What was your takeaway from, what did you learn about India, about Britain? I know, we've got about 2 minutes.
Well, I think I learned a lot. One of the things I learned was that most of the stories I've been told as a child were totally untrue, or because I was always told that my great grandmother was a governess, so was all the king and I and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I think it was much more interesting that she was a chambermaid. But anyway, the other thing I learned was that the Nawab's favourite wife was in fact had been an Abyssinian slave of his mother, and I hadn't realized that there were African slaves in India, and of course there was also a eunuch in charge of the women's quarters who was African. So and that's a whole area, and of course the other area is the nature of slavery in India, which was very different from the kind of slavery that I had been working and teaching on in America in terms of plantation slavery. I haven't learned enough about that yet. It's something I really would like to pursue and understand much better. So there were those kinds of things that I learned about the difference. And the other thing I think that I mentioned that surprised me was how much class and royalty meant to the British, and how much that trumped race and religion at that time. I think to some extent that's probably no longer true, but it's to some extent it may be. I think the fact that Meghan is is an actress has a lot to do with the hostility that she.
Well, there was always this fascination. So these exiled Indian princes, Dilip Singh and others, they had a fascination. So they would always have affairs with actresses.
Yes.
Dilip Singh did. His mistress was an actress. Yes. And chambermaids as well, I guess.
Yes,
because you could get to know them.
Dilip Singh also married a chambermaid.
He did,
eventually,
exactly.
yes.
Yeah. So Queen Victoria really disapproved of that, so not surprisingly. She refused to acknowledge his second wife, absolutely did not acknowledge. So anyway, right, I think we are done. So thank you all. Big round of applause for Lyn.